Let me just start out and first of all say thank you so much for joining us this morning. And as we think about what's happening in the market, we see inflation rates that are sky high, not coming down very quickly, and housing stock is a key part of that. And it's so substantial that when people I've talked to in the financial sector, with some of what your colleagues in this area are telling me, it's going to be a very, very long slog to sort of, you just can't you just can't disappear that escalation in prices. And I'd just be interested, Diane, as you sort of look at that challenge from not just home purchases, but home rental, just existing in American housing market for someone who's out making an okay middle-class living. What's happening and how do we help them?
Sure. Well, thanks for the opportunity to be here for this important conversation. And I think the key point to know there is that the lowest income renters and people who are experiencing homelessness are suffering the most in today's housing market. Even before the pandemic, we had about 10 million of the lowest income renter households who are paying at least half of their very limited incomes towards rent each month, and many were paying much more, 60, 70, 80% of their very limited incomes just to keep a roof over their heads. And when you have such limited income to begin with, and you pay so much of it for your home, you are always one financial shock away from missing rent, facing eviction, and in worst cases, becoming homeless. So for many of these same households, the pandemic was that financial shock. They lost jobs, they lost hours at work, they lost wages. It was harder than ever for them to cobble together what they needed to make rent. Congress responded, really federal governments at all levels responded in unprecedented ways with protections and resources to keep tenants stably housed. Now those protections have expired. Those resources are all but depleted.
So can I ask you real quick about, because one of the critiques was that a lot of those funds weren't used. What was happening in that case of the rental assistance that went unused in some states?
Oh, at this point, the vast majority of those funds have been spent or obligated. Yeah, it got off to a slow start because we had 500 new programs being stood up early in a pandemic. That takes time and focus and designing programs to ensure that they're meeting the needs of the lowest income and the most marginalized people takes time and effort in design. But at this point, those resources are nearly depleted. So those renters who struggled before the pandemic are even worse off now as costs are rising, rents are skyrocketing, and homelessness is increasing.
So you may not like this, but I'm now following you on Twitter.
Great.
And you had this really shocking tweet, and you say, as rents skyrocket, remember a $100 increase in median rent is associated with a 9% increase in homelessness.
That's right.
And we've had a higher than $100 increase in median. Yeah. So go into that unpack that for me.
That's the GAO.
Right.
That's their study where they found exactly $100 in monthly median rent increase results in a 9% increase in homelessness in that same community. And last year, rents increased by almost $200 per month, about $179, which is far more than we've seen rents increase in many, many years.
Right.
So again, those lowest income people are struggling. Many of them are falling into homelessness. Sometimes it's the homelessness that we see. It's visible homelessness. It's increased encampments. It's more people going to homeless shelters. Sometimes it's the invisible homeless. I thought the tweet you were going to mention was the one that I did yesterday, where I got this heartbreaking email from a mom and her disabled son that are living in a storage unit because their landlord raised rent higher than they can afford and they were evicted.
Yeah, I've seen that around the country. It's heartbreaking. I mean, it's just part of the real scene, and that we're trying to be very realistic today as we talk about. So Janneke, the Urban Institute where you're at, it's one of my favorite places. You are the, sort of the Wizard of Oz of data. You know everything going on, but I think broadly when you sort of look at the fairly bleak picture of what's happening right now, and I'm interested as you're thinking about programs to activate to give genuine assistance at scale to those who need it. And that's one of the things I'm always interested in. I hear a lot of boutique programs of folks helping some folks in towns or cities. I'm just looking for the scalable answer. So tell me what you think can be done out there to begin constructively addressing this need.
Well, first of all, I don't have all the answers myself, but I try to.
But you do have the data, right?
That's right. And I appreciate being here as well. And I really appreciate what Diane put in front of us as really the critical crisis still facing low-income renters. We are, as we have heard all morning long, some 3 to 5 million units short in housing. Units of all types, set aside whether they're renters or homeowners. It's across, up and down the housing spectrum, except for maybe.
And I just want to interrupt you. When we talk about low-income renters, they have income, right? The low-income renters,
Sure.
and they are renting and they're working, right? We have remarkably low unemployment in this country. So I just want to put that on the table, that we're talking about people who are engaged in this economy in our society that still can't get a roof over their heads.
That's right. That's right, but the supply shortage has been hitting all up and down the chain. I think the people who have weathered the recent crisis the best are the current homeowners. In some ways, home ownership represents a kind of affordable housing. People think of it as being high end, but it really provides stable, fixed rate housing costs for the long term, especially when rates are low.
Right.
So given that we're so many units short, that because of the underbuilding that's been going on since 2008, we are seeing rents go up, as we've just heard, incredibly high. We've seen house prices go up by 36% since the beginning of the pandemic.
Right.
So all of this is trapping more and more households in the rental space, right? We're really, whether we're talking about becoming a homeowner or maintaining your rent, we're still talking about the renters in this country. The homeowners have done pretty well. They've been
Right.
able to take low interest rates, fix
Well, the
their
homeowners did well if they could survive the big Great Recession.
Well, the Great Recession, but most recently the homeowners did extremely well because of the foreclosure moratorium,
Right.
which proved to be such a successful strategy. Lessons learned from 2008 foreclosure crisis we touched on earlier, just making it simple for homeowners to take advantage of the foreclosure moratorium and to take advantage of forbearance, and then to get back on their feet once those moratorium have expired. And foreclosure starts are lower now than they were at the
Right.
beginning of the pandemic. So homeowners, big winners, and we really do feel, while we're on that subject, that the lessons learned from that forbearance ought to be part of the permanent solution for keeping people in their homes. So on one end of the spectrum, giving more people at the top end of the renter market more access to homeownership is affordable housing solution, because that does fix the payments, and it is kind of a macro policy. And so homeowners are sitting pretty right now with their low payments. Renters are seeing their rents continue to go up. In a survey, most landlords expected to raise rents in the next 12 months, so it is not going to get any easier for current renters today. So, there's no single
So are
silver
there
bullet.
programs out there that you think are laudable, that are really useful in terms of giving a financial step up to those in that squeeze?
The renters are in a squeeze all up and down the spectrum,
Yeah.
and I think we all would have ideas about different segments and what can help them, everything from improved Section 8 voucher programs and making sure they're more accepted, ways to help with sustained renter counseling, ways to continue the income supports for renters that proved effective during the pandemic.
Right.
In the step up from renting to home ownership for those households that are ready, we've already heard a lot today, but I want to emphasize the importance of down payment assistance, especially for households who have not had the benefit of the intergenerational wealth. We heard about how a few generations ago, households of color were largely excluded from the big housing boom that really became the foundation for middle-class white wealth in this country.
Right.
And which give parents the opportunity to help their kids do things like buy a home. The median wealth of the parents of a white young adult today is over $200,000. The median wealth of the parents of a young black adult is less than $20,000. So it's clearly not enough to help your kids buy a home and still have something left over to fall back on. So helping households who have not had access to that intergenerational wealth through down payment assistance and low down payment loans is one key, and we can talk about some more details. But that
Danielle at Realtor.com, you're the chief economist there, and it's great to talk to you. So I assume you also see many of the trends that are going on out there. And I suppose if I were in industry, on one part of it is it looks very good for people in that industry if you're if you've got an asset. If you don't have an asset in this market, what do?
You don't have a home as an asset.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's challenging. It's challenging for renters in the market today because they are facing those increases.
Right.
Landlords are, even if they're not moving, landlords are increasing rent, and the majority of renter households report that their housing costs are the biggest source of financial strain. So it is a real issue, even for those who are staying put. For homeowners, if you have that asset, you're in a pretty good position right now, unless you're trying to move, and then you're also facing high costs in the market. But at least if you've owned your home for a period of time, you're sitting on likely a record high level of equity. In aggregate, the U.S. homeowners are sitting on a record high level of equity, so they're in a better position. But housing costs, whether you're moving and trying to buy or moving and trying to rent, are just up across the spectrum because we haven't built enough homes. A lot of people have estimates. Our estimate is that we were 5.8 million homes short at the start of 2022, and that number has likely worsened over the course of the year, even though builders are building close to the upper end of their recent range. We just saw new construction data out today, and it actually increased a little bit this morning. So, there's some bright news, but builders are facing a challenging market because as financial conditions shift, short-term buyer demand has really evaporated. It's hard for households to make mortgage payments today when they're 66% higher than they were 1 year ago for just the median house. That's because of home price increases and also because of interest rates going up. So it's a lot harder for households in the market today to make those numbers pencil out. And because of that, they're pulling back, and so builders are pulling back, even though we do have this long-term shortage situation. If you look at vacancy rates, homeowner vacancy rates are at record lows, and rental vacancy rates are not far behind. They're just a little bit above record lows, well under 6%. So when there's scarcity, which is what we're seeing in the housing market, the way the market balances that is by pushing up prices.
Let me ask you, in the world of home building or in that construction area, is it more lucrative for these large companies that build homes to build for the upper end of the market, as opposed to mixed use or affordable housing projects? When I talked with Mayor Bowser about this, she said that the packages that have to be put together, tax incentives, all this, are somehow very, very complex and very large to try to address this affordable housing crisis that we've had in Washington, D.C. And she took me on a tour once showing me lots of affordable housing that we built here. But the need is ever greater. And I guess I never really had an understanding of the complexity of that. So it raised the obvious question of, if I were a builder, why would I do that? And as you look across the country, are the incentives and packages and models robust enough to actually get the attention and resources there? Or do folks in the building industry just walk away and say, we don't want to do that, we just want to build for rich people?
So I don't work with builders, so I don't have a concrete answer. But based on what we see in the data, it is harder for them to build at those more affordable price points because we're not seeing that construction happen. And that's something that we've seen consistently over the years. So it is an ongoing challenge, and we haven't figured out a way to address that collectively as the private sector and with the public sector's help as well.
Is anybody here from Delaware? Any Delawareans? Anybody driven through Middletown, Delaware? Yeah, you have? Yeah, so I'm mentioning it because I'd love to have the mayor here. It's one of the it's like a boom town, right? I mean, I've lived on the Eastern Shore, had a house on the Eastern Shore for a long time, and Middletown, Delaware, which is near the Maryland border, you take, I guess, I forget what it is. It's 301 or something, and you're kind of going across the way. And this, all of these stores and giant box stores, everything have come up. But it has become a huge town, and I've seen lots of affordable housing go up. So the workers are working there. I have friends that are now, working there. And I'd love to just find out someday how that happened, because you do see not necessarily there's like the big Amazon thing out there and all of this other stuff, but you saw a plan come together, which I've been watching over the last decade, of essentially greater and greater investment in certain kinds of businesses, lots of services, but then the only thing that could support it was low-income housing for all the workers that would have to staff this. Now they've done it. Now, I don't know if it's a good thing I've seen. To me, it looks like a lot of sprawl, but I've seen tons of affordable housing units out there. So are there models out there that we ought to be looking to that are positive, as opposed to much of the picture that we're talking about today, which is pretty bleak?
Sure, there's effective programs that can help make homes affordable to low and extremely low income people, but they're underfunded compared to the need. And it's important to understand at the National Income Housing Coalition, we focus on extremely low-income
Right.
households, people who are at 30% or below area
Are those
median
mainly
income.
urban?
No, it's
They're urban
it's
and-
urban, suburban,
Yeah.
rural, and
Okay.
there is a shortage of homes affordable and available to them everywhere. The difference is from most severe to least severe in
I
terms
see.
of the shortage of homes for the lowest income people. And for those extremely low income households, and I'm talking about seniors or people with disabilities who have extremely limited fixed incomes, SSI
Right.
or SSDI, or families where the parents are working very low wage jobs, sometimes multiple low wage jobs, and can't afford the rent. So for those extremely low income households, the private market on its own cannot build and operate homes that are affordable to them because the rent that those households can pay
Right.
doesn't cover the costs.
So shouldn't the government step in
Yeah,
there?
exactly. That is a market failure
Right.
that requires a government intervention in the form of subsidies.
And where do we do that?
Well, the federal government has a number of very effective programs to build affordable apartments, the low-income housing tax credit, the National Housing Trust Fund, rental subsidies to, in some places, we need to build more apartments. There are
Right.
literally not enough apartments and they're not affordable to lowest income people. So we need to build apartments at all levels, but we need to build some, ensure that they are affordable to those lowest income people through construction subsidy programs like LIHTC and the National Housing Trust Fund. In some places for the lowest income people, there are enough apartments, but the people living in them can't afford them. So there needs to be a bridge between what they earn and what rent costs, and we do that in the form of rental assistance. Housing choice vouchers is our country's most successful program to end and prevent homelessness through housing choice vouchers. Altogether, in our country, only 1 in every 4 households that needs housing assistance and is eligible for it receives any. So 75% of households are eligible, they need housing assistance, they don't get any. It's just 25% that win what's essentially a housing lottery system in our country. So until the federal government steps up and is
Right.
willing to fund these successful programs at the scale necessary, these housing challenges for the lowest income people will persist.
Before I take a couple of questions, to be honest, let me ask Janneke and Danielle this question. I may be wrong, I'm usually wrong in predicting the economy, but I think a crisis is coming. And I think it's a crisis of some sort which will be very painful for working Americans again, because we see a Federal Reserve that seems quite committed to raising interest rates to a level. Larry Summers is basically saying we will not have done what we need to do as far as central bankers until we essentially see a doubling of the current unemployment rate, which is pretty staggering. So if that is right, and I sort of think that Chairman Powell's comments recently are pointing in that kind of direction, then there's going to be a financial reshuffling in this country at some level. So if we were to anticipate a crisis and look at this problem being exacerbated, so then there's something for policymakers to react to, what would you say we need to actually immediately do in a time of crisis to rewire this so that we can make a substantial investment in correcting some parts of this problem? Janneke?
So I'm going to let Danielle, the economist, predict the future of the economy.
Well, you have to presume this is going to happen.
Well,
We're going to have nastiness.
It's happened a few times
Yeah.
lately, so
Right.
I think we can get comfortable with this idea.
Right.
And every time it happens, there's a reshuffling. We see the people who have the least, especially households
Right.
of color, taking the biggest hit. And frankly, as we've been talking about the sort of winners and losers from the recent pandemic, home-owning households,
Right.
majority of white households, really fared on the main pretty well from the equity increase and the ability to reduce their payments. Whereas renters, again, the majority of households of color are renters.
Right.
They have been taking it really hard. So every time around, we heard earlier today about how the 2008 crisis and the predatory lending really stripped wealth from communities of color, much more so than white households. So every time there's a crisis, unless we keep an eye on this continuing equity gap, how is it that we haven't gotten any closer to closing the racial homeownership gap since discrimination was made illegal in
Right.
housing? So we need to just keep our eye on that ball and stay focused on it for a change, and actually exercise the will to keep our eye on that problem and make sure that each new successive crisis doesn't continue to exacerbate the gap we have.
Danielle, I know that this is putting you in an awkward spot before we go to the audience, but I am interested in this question of how do you use a crisis for good, and if we're going that direction, and you see yet again, because my view of this after talking to Emanuel Cleaver is that the U.S. Congress, the federal level, has figured, despite these problems, that they are largely absorbable and ignorable. And I'm glad we're doing this program today because I disagree with that. But if we do have much more pressure and stress and the squeeze, as we were just discussing, hitting these families, is there not something that should be thought of and done in advance that might try to rewire this, maybe around some of these programs, and pre-position the response as opposed to just reacting to it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an excellent question. How do you build the will when you face a crisis? What's, I think, interesting about the pandemic is that it was very different than the previous financial crisis.
Right.
And that's because there was no finger pointing. There was no, you're in this situation because of your own bad choices. There was a collective understanding that we faced a problem and we needed to do something about it. And so I think in a way that can serve as a good example for what we should try to achieve, which is to work together to focus on the solutions. Now, as far as how we specifically address these big problems, I mean, we need to build more housing. That's very, very clear. I don't know the best way for the federal government to actually make that happen, but we do need to build more housing across the income spectrum. That is certainly clear, and in areas across the country to make sure that it's available.
We have time for a couple of minutes for questions. We've got one right back here, yes. And we're going to bring you the microphone. And we're recording this, so tell us who you are and where you're from.
Okay, yes, thank you, good morning.
Or you can use another name that's not yours. No one's going to, yeah, go ahead.
Thanks, my name's Jake, I'm from HUD, and I just have a question about one of the themes that is reoccurring throughout this conversation from multiple folks. One thing I'm interested in is, the different local areas that may have prohibitive laws or regulations that make development harder.
Right.
And I was wondering if we've seen, regional effects here, if it's worse in some areas or metropolitan hubs worse than others, and, what possible solutions might be to make those more accessible for development.
That's great. Can I ask you just one quick question? At HUD, because you have a direct line-on view of the programs that you're supporting out there, do you feel they are robust and getting wider, or do you think they're under pressure and getting narrower?
Well, I am 3 months in, so.
Okay. So everything looks robust and new. Okay, great. Thank you. That's a great answer. Thoughts, Danielle?
So yes, it does matter where you are. It does matter the policies that the local government has. Builders are better able to build in some areas because there aren't as restrictive zoning policies. That said, once you have zoning policies in place, it can be very difficult to change. I live in a Virginia suburb that's very progressive, and I can't tell you the number of yard signs where people are fighting upzoning in this very progressive, relatively urban area. So it is really, it's nice to think about. We know that is a needed solution, but it's a lot harder when it hits close to home. So I think to the extent we can incentivize local governments for making those difficult choices, because they will be difficult choices, because people don't like change, even if it's going to come gradually. And so I think to the extent that we can, first raising awareness, and then having incentives for local governments to undertake those tough choices.
Diane, Janneke, do you see regional characteristics?
Yes, and I would just say, I think, of course, the biggest incentive for local governments to do better is federal funding,
Right.
and whether or not they get it.
Right.
And for a long time, the conversation has been around HUD dollars and maybe restricting the allocation of those funds based on whether states and localities are doing more to reduce restrictive zoning, and that's certainly a good start, but it's those much larger pots of funding, the infrastructure dollars, the highway dollars, that communities won't turn down. They need those funds, where we should really be looking to either incentivize or require changes at the local level. And the Biden administration has been making some progress there with some of the funds that have come through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, where they are judging proposals for those funds and scoring communities that are doing more on restrictive zoning higher to be able to receive those funds sooner. That's a really important step.
Janneke, quick thoughts?
I agree with everything that's been said, and I think those large overarching points are the critical takeaways. I can mention some specific segments where better changes to regulatory local reform coupled with financing tools, which might actually be more of a federal, but for example, manufactured housing has been, just like every other form of housing, well depressed in the number of shipments that we're doing annually for the past 15 years or so compared to what they used to be. It's come a long way. It's more environmentally sustainable as well. A key kind of niche piece of the affordable housing supply puzzle, especially in certain markets. And there, again, zoning requirements as well as challenges that would-be buyers face in getting financing, safe quality financing to afford those homes. Could be two sides of the coin. Condominiums are another one that faces sort of regulatory hurdles on the one hand and financing challenges for would-be owners on the other. ADUs, accessory dwelling units, are coming online as a key piece. We estimate they could add over 200,000 units a year for both rental and potentially home ownership, but largely low-income rental. Again, that relies on local zoning and permitting flexibilities, as well as on providing current homeowners the kind of financing that they can use to build those units. So those are some specific examples of how various pieces can be enhanced.
Great, thank you. We got one last question here.
Thank you. Leon Peace from here in Washington, D.C. My concern is, I guess, one of the, an often ignored underside of the housing crisis is homelessness and poverty.
Right.
And what I want to ask is, what initiatives do you see or foresee as being effective in reducing homelessness? For example, the tiny homes projects in the California area. Do you see any more viable options to deal with that increasing problem?
Thank you very much. And I've interviewed the tiny homes folks. I sort of saw it as a different track today, but at one level for veterans, that was one of the veteran strategies for homeless veterans, particularly in California, San Diego area. But would love to hear your thoughts when we start with you, Janneke, on poverty and homelessness.
Well, it all comes back at the end of the day right now to the critical problem on the table. There's not enough supply of houses that people can afford at almost every level of income and housing needs. So anything that can add affordable units is going to alleviate some of that pressure. We do need to make sure that all this new affordable construction is actually geared to and accessible to the people who need it the most.
Yeah. Diane, quick
answer. Just very quickly, that homelessness at its root is a lack of access to affordable and accessible housing. So we need to build more homes and make them affordable to the lowest income people. That's going to take some time. So in the meantime, we need far more robust and permanent tenant protections that keep people in the homes that they're in. One thing that people don't realize when we talk about homelessness is that communities are ending homelessness every day on the individual level. In the city of LA, where homelessness is maybe best known and most visible, on any given day, they are moving about 200 people from homelessness into stable housing. On that same day, about 225 people fall into homelessness. So as much as we are working to move people off the streets, out of shelters into affordable housing, we also have to prevent the wave of new homelessness that's right on the horizon. And that comes through all of the programs that we talked about today, and protections against egregious rent hikes, against unjust or unreasonable evictions, and so on.
Danielle, final word.
Yeah, I think the one thing we definitely agree on, we need to build more housing across the income spectrum, and the sooner we do that, the better.
What I would just say to the gentleman here is that on whether it's tiny homes and whatnot, which I once said, is this a fad or is this really dealing with something? And I have to tell you, I still have mixed views on that, but it was very clear on veterans. It was a very interesting way in which veteran homelessness was approached. But I'll tell you one last kind of bank shot on this as a policy issue, which for those of you who are very interested, I'm really interested in how the LEED certification organization that works with buildings, and you get these LEED certification for sort of certain platinum or post-platinum or kryptonite, whatever it may be, but they're increasingly applying this to communities and looking what are the dimensions of health and getting LEED certification for community development. And as part of that, I think affordable housing and integration, diversity, inclusion, local coffee shops, all of this, various forms of transport are part of that. But next time we do this, we should bring the folks that do that, because I think that's another way when you can get communities competing with one another, that they're putting a priority on addressing this issue as part of their gold star rating. Then you can probably see how you might get some competitive forces going that might begin to deal with this much more, and resources and priorities put in there. But let me thank Diane Yentel, President and CEO of the National Low Income Housing Coalition, Janneke Ratcliffe, the Vice President of the Housing Finance Policy Center at the Urban Institute. You should check out the Urban Institute. Danielle Hale, Chief Economist at Realtor.com. Thank you very much for today, really. And Jason, you want to say a few words as we close?
Very few words. On behalf of The Hill and our sponsor, Wells Fargo, we'd like to thank all of you who joined us here today and those who tuned in on the live stream. If you missed any portion of today's discussion, all of the conversations will be posted on thehill.com as well as our The Hill Events YouTube channel. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks.